On July 29, 1958, President Dwight Eisenhower signed the National Aeronautics and Space Act. No rocket left the pad at that moment. No astronaut climbed into a capsule. So why did one signature matter as much as a launch? The tension was that the United States needed to answer Soviet rockets without turning every future satellite, laboratory, and astronaut into a purely military instrument. The important action was quieter. Ink on paper changed the way the United States would organize ambition, fear, science, and public risk in space. NASA began as an institution before it became a set of famous images. According to NASA history and contemporary policy records, the pressure behind the signature came from the sky. In October 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, and Americans could hear a beeping machine pass overhead. The sound was small, but the political shock was huge. It suggested that rockets, satellites, schools, laboratories, and military power were now part of one contest. Explorer I answered in January 1958 and discovered the Van Allen radiation belts, but success did not erase the larger problem. American space work was scattered among military services, research laboratories, contractors, and the older National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. NACA mattered because it had already spent decades learning how air moved over wings, engines, and experimental aircraft. Langley, Ames, Lewis, and flight test engineers knew how to turn danger into measurements. But NACA had been built for aeronautics, not for a national space program watched by the world. Eisenhower had to decide whether space would become mainly a military branch of the Cold War or a civilian agency with military knowledge nearby. That distinction was not cosmetic. A civilian agency could publish science, cooperate internationally, hire university talent, and represent peaceful exploration even while using technology born close to missiles. Congress wrote that compromise into law. The surviving text of the act shows the central cause and effect. Civilian authority would lead aeronautical and space research, while national security work would remain with the Defense Department. The act gave NASA responsibility for research into flight inside and outside the atmosphere. It transferred NACA into the new agency and allowed other projects, people, and facilities to move with it. That boundary was never perfectly clean, because rockets do not care whether a payload is scientific or military. Historians still debate how fully peaceful the early language could be inside a missile-age contest, but the boundary gave American spaceflight a public face and a legal mission: expand human knowledge, improve aeronautical and space vehicles, preserve the role of the United States as a leader, and make results available when security allowed. The signature therefore mattered because it created capacity before triumph. NASA inherited wind tunnels, test stands, engineers, pilots, and unfinished problems. It absorbed lessons from Vanguard, Explorer, the Army Ballistic Missile Agency, and the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. It had to learn tracking, telemetry, launch reliability, crew selection, public communication, and failure investigation at the same time. Project Mercury soon turned that architecture into human risk. The astronaut became a national symbol, but behind the helmet stood thousands of calculations, contracts, ground stations, technicians, and managers trying to make a dangerous machine behave. NASA also changed what space was for. Satellites promised weather prediction, communication, navigation, Earth observation, and scientific discovery. Robotic probes could scout the moon and planets before people went farther. Space became a place where prestige and practical knowledge were tied together. When John Kennedy later set the lunar goal, he did not create the institution from nothing. He used the civilian structure that the 1958 Act had made possible. The Apollo program became the most famous proof of that structure, but the deeper legacy is broader. NASA survived after the first race because it was more than a race. It became a way for a democratic government to make technical risk public. Failures were investigated, budgets were argued over, missions were named, and images of Earth from space changed the language of exploration. The agency could be criticized precisely because it belonged to the public. The law Eisenhower signed on July 29 did not solve every tension. Civilian exploration and military technology remained intertwined. Ambition competed with cost, prestige sometimes outran patience, but the act made an institutional bet that careful engineering, open science, and public purpose could turn Cold War pressure into lasting capability. Every launch since then carries a trace of that decision. NASA was born when the United States decided that reaching space required not only rockets, but a public institution strong enough to learn, fail, explain, and try again.